book of Revelation at the end of the Bible is not the easiest part of Scripture to understand. It is an example of what is called apocalyptic literature, describing the end times. And so, as a part of that kind of literature, it includes a lot of allegory, a lot of symbolism that can make it difficult always to know exactly what to make of what's being described. Personally, I think we're all going to be surprised, by elements at least, of what the final days actually look like. But today I want to focus on one particular detail out of Revelation, which has gotten a lot of attention because of its interest to Jehovah's Witnesses. And this is the description of a group of 144,000, which is described and singled out in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14. And according to Jehovah's Witnesses, this group marks a special group of Jehovah's Witnesses who are going to live forever in heaven with God, while the remainder of the saved live on earth, in a new earth for eternity, but do not go to commune with God in heaven. And they argue that if we read Revelation 7 and 14 correctly, that it'll lead us to this understanding as well, supporting their own theology. Well, what are we to make of that? Let's start by looking at Revelation 7 to see what is actually being described. So, Revelation 7, we'll begin in verse 3, as an angel is addressing other angels who have been granted to harm the earth and the sea, and then picking up in verse 3, saying, quote, "Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees, until we have sealed the bondservants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. From the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. And then continuing, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. And they cry out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Now, what this passage describes is somewhat obscure. In fact, there is at least two main interpretations of Revelation 7, and then again Revelation 14, which adds a few additional details about this multitude of 144,000, including the fact that it says they have not defiled themselves with women, that they are virgins. There's, as I said, basically two main interpretations, at least two, of this passage from Orthodox Christianity. One view is to say that all of these details should be understood literally, that there will be a group of 144,000 from the particular tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each, and they will, in all of these details, be exactly as described. The other view, which I hold to, believes that we ought to interpret this description symbolically, that it is describing the multitude, in fact, actually the great multitude, that is described at the end of that passage I read, that what preceded it, the 144,000, is essentially a stylized presentation of the sufficiency and beauty of that great multitude. And there's a few reasons why I think it's better to read this passage symbolically. And they are, among other things, that there are many details here that seem to be stylized, that seem to point to a symbolic completeness and fullness. So, for example, we have the fact that the numbers are 12 times 12 times 1,000. So 12 tribes with 12,000 each. In the Bible, 12 is a number of completeness, of fullness. So, for example, we have 12 tribes, 12 apostles. And so we have completeness times 1,000. It speaks to the full multitude. It's a perfect, full, round number, speaking to God having saved all exactly as he intends. And of course, as we look to the New Testament, we find that the church, you and I, are the descendants of Abraham, that we inherit the covenant blessings given to Israel, the covenant promises. And so when it speaks of the perfect, complete fullness of the tribes of Israel, that's you and me, brother and sister. We are that full, rich harvest. But it's more than just that. There are some interesting features about, say, the tribes. Now, this list of 12 tribes is a little bit odd, primarily because the tribe of Dan is excluded. In its place, the tribe of Manasseh is mentioned, which is a little bit odd because the list mentions the tribe of Joseph, but Joseph was Manasseh's father. And so usually you would list the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Ephraim, which were Joseph's two sons. But it's odd to mention Joseph and then just fill in Manasseh. What seems to be happening is that this list is intentionally a list of 12 tribes. Again, that sense of 12 being the number of fullness. But we wanted to exclude, the author did, the tribe of Dan. Because if we read going all the way back to the book of Judges, the tribe of Dan did not enter into their promise in the promised land. They did not gain their territory. And they're very early on associated with idolatry, falling away. They become a site of much idolatry throughout the history of Israel. And so in keeping with this sense of a perfect, pure multitude, we have Dan excluded and Manasseh filled in its place, right alongside their father, Joseph. Again, indicating this just desire to have 12 tribes, but not Dan among them. And that desire for symbolic purity helps us to understand then in Revelation 14 when it speaks of this multitude of 144,000 being pure, not having defiled themselves with women. What's with that? Well, that seems to indicate, again, just to be symbolic of the perfect purity of God's people, cleansed by the blood of Christ. After all, in both the Old and New Testament, the Bible doesn't view sex as being an inherently impure or gross thing. So in this context, it's not that somehow if you've had intercourse, you're not fit for heaven, but chastity again represents that perfect purity that we'll all enjoy, that we do all enjoy as the atoned for children of God. So there's a number of details that argue for a symbolic reading. There's also some details that argue against a literal reading, such as, for example, how in the world would you have, how could you even speak of 12,000 people who are members of the tribe of Gad or Asher or Manasseh or what have you? If you think of the number of generations of Jewish people intermarrying themselves between tribes, marrying with other races, the idea that you'd be able even to trace back and find 12,000 people who were purely from each of these 12 tribes, that also doesn't seem realistic, and points once again to a metaphorical, a symbolic reading here. So again, I think that our best reading of this passage is to indicate the perfect, beautiful completeness of God's salvation. That 12 times 12 times 1,000, this beautiful round number of fullness is saved. And then having laid out this sort of geometrical perfection of those who are pure, those who are the descendants of those of Israel and inherit the promises in the covenant. Then John goes on to speak of this great multitude, and he describes this great multitude no one can count. which he has just stylistically and symbolically described with the 12 times 12 times 1,000. Now again, your mileage may vary here. There is a case that could be made for rather understanding this section as being entirely literal. Some argue that you literally are going to have in the final day 12 tribes, 12,000 from each, that serve a special purpose, play a special role, that are literally virgins, serving the special role within God's final plan for the end times. My point today is not to litigate that argument with my Christian brothers as to which is the best reading of the passage, but rather, let's go back to that interpretation and understanding by the Jehovah's Witnesses, which they argue is the natural reading of the passage, and again supports their theology, which is not shared by really any Orthodox Christian group. This idea of the 144,000, which alone get to heaven, and then again all the other saints of God remain on earth for eternity. Again, a exalted earth, but nonetheless simply an earthly hope. What they argue, the Jehovah's Witnesses, is that that description at the beginning of Revelation 7 is a description of, again, the 144,000, and then that great multitude is the great multitude that yet remains on earth and has that earthly hope alone. Now, the problem with this reading is that it does great violence to the passage, because it literally splits the passage right in half and says, this part is literal, but this part is symbolic and figurative. If you roll back in your memory a second, remember that, again, my preferred interpretation sees all of those details of the 144,000 as being symbolic, of having a stylized meaning. And then again, the other interpretation, which I don't hold, but which I recognize and respect, is that it's entirely literal. Well, I've actually talked about this with Jehovah's Witnesses, and you can say, okay, so do you believe this 144,000, the only ones who get to go to heaven, do you believe they're going to be literally all men, again, male virgins? And they say, no, that's a symbolic detail. Do you believe they're all going to be virgins? No, that's a symbolic detail. Do you believe that they're all going to be only Jewish? The only people who get to go to heaven are actually ethnic Jews, 12,000 from each of the tribes. And they say, no, that's a symbolic detail. In fact, they'll make a similar argument to the one that I made about how that list looks stylized because it doesn't include Dan and so on and so forth. So, male, stylized, not literal. Virgins, stylized, symbolic, not literal. 12,000 from each of the Jewish tribes, stylized, not literal. Is 144,000, is that a literal detail? Yes, definitely. That's literal. That's the exact number of those who get to go to heaven, and then again the remainder remain on earth. So right in the middle of the description, you have a picture. John paints this single picture of this group with these details. And the Jehovah's Witness interpretation, the Jehovah's Witness reading, goes in and wrenches it apart and says these details are symbolic, but these details are to be taken literally. It does not make any sense, even in its approach to that particular text. And of course, in light of the context of the rest of Scripture, where it is clear from Jesus' words throughout the New Testament and the words of the Bible elsewhere, such as Jesus' promise to the thief on the cross that today you will be with me in glory, in heaven, in paradise, is his promise. That's the promise of the gospel, that all of us will be in our Father's house in heaven with Christ. It's the plain promise of the gospel. And the only way to get a different message out of that particular passage of Revelation 7 is to do great violence to the passage, to wrest it in half, and insist arbitrarily on half of it being stylized and symbolic, half of it being literal. And that just doesn't make sense.